So I've made the outer and middle table sections. They're curing over here, just like glue and a single biscuit on each corner. And then I'm working on the innermost section. However, because we have a circular fire pit perimeter, I'm gonna fill in the corners here. You can see I just have a wire and a nail at the center mark of this inner frame, and the pencil's at the radius to provide an 1/8 inch clearance to the frame of the fire pit. So this may vary based on your fire pit diameter, but I just need to make a piece of wood that fills in at least this arc, and I'm just gonna put biscuits in the side of the wood as well as along the corners, and then we'll come in and use a follower bit on the router to actually generate this curved section when it's after it's all cured. So I cut these triangle pieces just from one width of the full width board, and it covers the arc that we will need. So I'm just going to route an 1/8 inch radius on each of these sections before we glue it together. So I'm just going to use the freehand router with an 1/8 inch radius bit on here. I've already centered it, and I've got a hole in the table, and these bar clamps have a button on the end of the bar to allow you to remove the one half of the clamp. So you can pass it through a hole, and then just make sure that the router plate doesn't end up hitting the bar clamp. And we're just gonna route both sides of this inner edge on these guys, and then we'll use the router in the table for the small pieces, the corner pieces. So I just routed one face of these corners, and you can see some of them did not come out with a full radius along the wood, but that's just because the plywood table is wavy and not really a great reference surface. This is why you would buy at least an insert, or preferably like an actual router table. But this will be good enough for what we're doing. So now I'm going to mark off the lines for the biscuit joiner. So we just need a reference line where the pieces we want to mate will have biscuits that we can line up with these red marks in the biscuit joiner. So we'll go and do that now. All right, so we've marked the top face here. There's a line roughly in the center, and marked a number or some indicator so that we remember how to match these guys up. And then similarly, we mark these lines. Just be careful not to get pencil mark on the radius, because once these are glued together, you're not going to be able to sand that off very easily. So I'm going to glue the perimeter first, just putting a bead of glue down. Got these number 20 biscuits. And then we're going to clamp it together with this strap, and I have it elevated on this wood, scrap wood, so that we can clamp the faces with these clamps, with bar clamps. So I aligned all the corners, and it generally seems like they all match up. However, there is a slight angle mismatch here, and to avoid that, what I'd recommend is, instead of, like, I tried to get the saw to be exactly 45 degrees with the right angle square, and obviously I missed by like a fraction of a degree. So what I'd recommend is to cut 2 of the 4 boards on their good side, and then 2 of the 4 boards on the bad side, and have maybe the angle of the blade be something like 46 degrees, so that it's like a little bit obvious, or just mark the wood. But basically, if you cut 2 of the boards on the bad side, you go and flip them to the good side, all the corners should match up. However, you would have to make sure that both cuts of the bad side board are this same angle. So just basically don't move the angle of the saw once you start cutting. And if there's already an existing 45, just like resurface it with, if you've moved the saw, just to ensure the angle is what you expect it to be. That's probably the best way to ensure you don't have this slight gap here. So when you apply the glue to these guys, make sure you bias the glue toward the bottom so that you don't get this, the glue creeping up like I did on the first one here. And then also just generally use it sparingly, especially on the biscuits. So, let's see here. Yeah, and then if you do get some migration upward, just remove it and wipe it from both surfaces, reapply it, and then if it doesn't seem like there's any glue creeping up, then just clamp it with a bar clamp right on this piece of plastic. That seems to work pretty well, and then ensure they're coplanar with another single bar clamp seems to do the job. A little bit of a lip probably won't be too noticeable. So now we're going to make a half round template for the follower bit so that we can cut the half round on the piece of ipe. And basically the way I'm doing it is I've got a piece of wood. So I know my radius, basically leaving a 1/4 inch of clearance on the radius to the rim of the fire pit. And the rim of the fire pit is 27.5 inches. So, and then the follower bit is a 1/2 inch diameter, the bearing there, and the cutting diameter. So I'm gonna go to 13.5 inches, and I basically just measured out from the edge of the bit to the center point here is 13.5 inches. So I just got a nail, I drilled a hole, a little bit of a clearance hole in the plywood, and made sure that, you know, it'll cut at least for half a circle. So I'm gonna go ahead and run the router just to like bore through the whole thing, and be careful that your hands aren't close to the bit when you do this, and make sure that the nail is like really solid in place. I just got it going through the table here, but yeah, when you plow through wood, the bit will like tend to try to grab a particular edge and start pulling the wood. So you got to be really careful. Basically, just make sure your fixturing is really solid. Cut in half round. So I traced a circle that is going to be the final edge, and you know, it's not perfect. It might be plus or minus an eighth of an inch because this nail bends, but basically I just put a spacer on the nail that is like roughly the same height as the wood, and then I made the wire and the pencil the correct radius, and I'm going to use the reciprocating saw to get it close, hopefully within a 1/4 inch, so that we have at least half the router bit, or less than half the router bit cutting wood, and we'll see how it goes. All right, well, it is difficult to see the line, even though I drew it dark, so maybe use one of those wax pencils, but the wax might be hard to get off. However, I bet you could sand it off. Anyway, what I did is I rigged up like the blowgun, taped it to the reciprocating saw, and then deflected the air close to, you know, where the blade is, and then I even have like a little shop light that I'm holding in my hand as I'm cutting, and just go slow because you know, you only have like this thin slot to look through. So I'll show you how I was doing it. Well, the reciprocating saw works, but I would highly recommend, I did mess up a little bit here. We'll see how it turns out. We'll just sand it, buff it out. But yeah, I would use a high-powered jigsaw if you can get one of those nice Bosch or Makita jigsaws that take like a 6-inch blade or something. I would get that thing because it probably has a blower and a light built in. But this reciprocating saw will work if you don't have the jigsaw and you don't have another need for one. All right, so I'm getting set up to use the follower bit on the router, and I have these 5/8 inch thick pieces of plywood that have clearance to where I'm gonna be cutting. So the plywood is like, the edge of the plywood is roughly here, and that'll allow the router bit to come right up on the edge of the line here, following this 1/2 inch thick plywood that we cut earlier. And then I basically just, you know, tacked a nail into the workbench and had the head of the nail be below the top face of the ipe. And then I just have a tape measure running between the center marks of each edge to ensure the nail is centered. So just check, you know, top down, check to make sure we're centered both edges, and then you can we'll clamp the ipe onto the shims as well as the center board. But we're actually going to start over here where I overshot the line. That'll allow me to drop in the router bit, and we can set it up right now. Actually, I also had the plywood didn't form a full arc. There was a little bit of a gap, which will allow me to drop, this was unintentional, but it's actually useful. It'll allow me to drop the router bit in here. So I'll clamp this guy down, and then we'll come along and run the follower bit through this roughly half circle, and then we'll rotate this and do it again, finish it off. well, I messed up on the dimensions here, so this defeated the purpose of using the reciprocating saw. I must have used the same radius as this form, but obviously the router bit, like we planned, is a 1/2 inch greater on the radius. So the router was really struggling to plow through this. Not only was it struggling, but there was a fair amount of chatter. I really had to like force the bearing into the form to keep it from chattering. So it ended up being like a fairly clean cut, and this does work. Like this, you could do this without using the reciprocating saw, but the router was really struggling. And what actually happened is, whatever this garbage, surge protector fuse is rated to, it's got a little breaker and it's probably 10 amps or something, maybe 15. That thing just popped. So it wasn't an overheating issue. It wasn't like the actual circuit breaker. It was just one of those, the surge protector. So basically I'm gonna just keep going here, and I think it'll turn out all right. I just wanted to also mention, all I did with the form was I tacked it down with a screw, a drywall screw, a single screw. So I'm just gonna remove this screw when we go and do the other half. We may even need to do 3 like sections here, but I might as well actually just rotate it right now that we're stopped. So yeah, we'll get the full circle out of it. So it was hard to tell because it was a time-lapse video, but the Ipe did slip when I was plowing through with the router over here. And basically what I did is I just put another clamp in place. But essentially the lesson learned there is definitely what I'd recommend is drawing the correct radius circle, and just like double check your work, which is something I failed to do. And then that'll ensure that, if we were to take the router bit properly, if this circle were to be drawn properly, only about half the router bit, like the radius of the router bit would be cutting, and it would be much more smooth. It would be much lower load on the motor. So that's the proper way to do it. And now that it's still clamped, we're just gonna go around with the 1/8 inch radius router bit on the inside, and then we'll kind of clamp it on individual corners and do the opposite side to do the outer edge radius. All right, now we're just gonna route with this 1/8 inch radius router bit, the edges that were joined and ripped. And basically I've got like one corner on the workbench, and then I've got these work stands supporting the other corners, and then just put a single clamp on it. And then I go around with the orbital sanders, and 120 and 180 grit actually leave like pretty smooth finish. You can go higher, but I'm not even gonna put oil on these, so that if it feels good, it's probably good enough. Just go by judgment, but it does sand fairly well despite the high density.